This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. This episode, we are talking therapy talk. You know, just think of the phrases that we're all kind of saying these days. Protecting my peace, standing on business and my boundaries, red flag, toxic. It's just like we casually use these all the time now. Like, do you know what they mean? Like, actually know? Or do you know, you just kind of nod along when you hear that because it sounds like it's emotionally mature and clever. It low-key sounds like an explanation while giving you zero information. Like, what does protecting your peace actually mean? Is it, I'm in therapy processing real stuff? Does it mean I don't feel like texting that person back? I mean, it could be both. It could mean neither. Just what that phrase is, it's a bit of a nothing burger. It says a lot, but nothing at the same time. And so what I want to talk about today is therapy speak, and just a disclaimer, this episode is not to dog on therapy. I have benefited personally a lot from therapy. It's great. It helps people. What I really want to talk about is the language that's kind of leaked out of the therapy room and to everywhere else. I'm talking group chats, dating profiles, HR emails, protest signs, influencer TikToks, presidential campaigns. And what I really want to get into, because it is really that deep, is I want to trace where it came from, who's selling it back to us, and, who quietly got left behind in the translation. Because here's my, thesis going into this kōrero. In the last 15 years, it seems like, we've taken a set of tools that were built for something really specific, i.e. understanding your own patterns, so you could, heal, process, show up better for yourself and the people in your life. And it's kind of like it's been repackaged into something else. It's become a way of talking about yourself that kind of stops any kind of substance coming through. So, let's kind of break things down before we get into the analysis. So therapy speak is clinical or semi-clinical language, terms like trauma, triggered, gaslighting, attachment style, boundaries, holding space, doing the work, that had started inside, clinical settings. And the transition into everyday conversation, particularly through heavy on social media, and, on its own, none of these words are the problem. They have a purpose. They were built to describe real things. Gaslighting is a real manipulation tactic with a real definition. Attachment styles are real researched framework. Boundaries are real and useful concept in healthy relationships. The shift I want to talk about isn't that these words exist. It's what happens when, relational vocabulary, which is designed to be worked through slowly with a trained person, over time gets flattened into public performance vocabulary. Something that you can just drop into a caption, something that functions less like insight and more like a costume. And there's a writer I really admire on this topic, Aishat Akambi, and she's written about this, I think, better than almost anyone I've read. And her argument, roughly, is that therapy speak has started to function the way a luxury logo functions in fashion. You don't wear the logo because of the stitching quality. You wear it to signal something about yourself to everyone looking. And she makes this argument that therapy speak has kind of become its own signal. It's a way to say, like, hey, I'm emotionally literate, I'm self-aware, I'm doing the work. Even when, if you actually sat with what was said, there's very little content in there at all. And so there's kind of like this hollowing effect where the more a phrase gets used to perform depth, the less depth it can actually hold. And I think that's what I really want to get into. This is a tension that I want to sit with for this kōrero, because it's not is therapy speak bad, but more what happens to a tool when it becomes a costume. What do you lose? Who benefits from losing it? And because a costume implies a stage, if we're really running with this metaphor, who built the stage in the first place? So I really want to focus on who's doing the repackaging and why. So if we follow money for a second, because I think regardless of how you feel about money, it talks, it's loud, and it says something, unfortunately, in this world. So if we follow where the money is, because I think that's a part that gets skipped a lot when it comes to conversations about therapy speak. But people love to talk about this as a purely cultural phenomenon. Like it just kind of happened. It's based on vibes. It's nobody's fault. But it didn't just happen. It got sold to us deliberately by people who make money when you believe your problems are individual and purchasable rather than collective and structural. Some numbers, because honestly, when you think about it, the numbers are kind of stunning when you sit with them. The global wellness economy, that's everything from, mindfulness apps to executive coaching to just the healing industry broadly, was valued at around $6.7 trillion in 2024. Trillion, not billion, trillion with a T. The self-help industry specifically pulls in over $11 billion a year in the US alone. And so that mental wellness market, which is separate from actual mental health care, is valued around $121 billion. And something like 3/4 of self-help books in the US are bought by women. So, let's sit with that last fact for a little bit. 3/4 of self-help books in the US are bought by women, because we are going to talk about girlhood later on in this episode. But here's the thing about an industry that size. It needs an endless supply of new problems to solve, because a solved problem is a customer you lose. So the incentive isn't actually to help you heal and move on. The incentive is to help you identify a new symptom, discover a new attachment wound, diagnose a new trauma response in yourself. There's always another workbook, another course, another 5-day boundaries boot camp, another supplement for your nervous system. The industry doesn't profit from your wellness. It profits from your ongoing pursuit of wellness. And this is where the language, I think, does the real work, because vague clinical language is incredibly good at making a normal human problem. You're broke, you're isolated, your job is exploitative, your government isn't taking care of you. It makes it sound like a personal internal problem that a purchase can fix. Regulate your nervous system. It sells a lot better than your workplace is horribly understaffed and your manager is cruel, because one of those things you can address, by buying a weighted blanket or another self-help book, and another one requires you to, organize with your co-workers, or re-evaluate if this is mahi that you want to do. Is it purpose fit for now? And that's slower and scarier and doesn't have a checkout page. And I know I always talk about bell hooks, but it's coming back again. Bell hooks wrote exactly about this, actually, long before self-care, was a hashtag. She warned that when capitalism gets hold of the idea of self-care, it turns into something you buy, whether it's a candle or a bath bomb or a retreat. instead of something you actually do, which is often, much less glamorous. It's, setting a boundary that costs you something, saying no to a shift that you can't afford to say no to, resting, even though rest doesn't look or feel productive. And, her point is that that version of self-care it doesn't have that depth. It's that version being sold to us as a decoy. It, gestures at care while asking nothing of the system that made you exhausted in the first place. And I'm not here to say that candles and retreats and bath bombs are not important. Once in a blue moon, I do like to do them myself, but I think we just need to be real about the depth of that and, how that doesn't capture what self-care really is. And so, the question we've got to ask here is, well, who's doing the repackaging if there clearly is a really big wellness industry that you can profit off? So, who's doing the repackaging? And realistically, the answer doesn't lie with just one group or one thing. I think it's a few overlapping things. And I also think it's worth naming them plainly instead of just kind of vaguely saying, well, it's capitalism. Because, even though it is capitalism, it's obviously the water that we're all swimming in. So I think it's helpful to be, a bit more specific. I think first is wellness and self-help brands themselves, the coaches, the app companies, the supplement lines, all of them who need you to believe your problems are individual and fixable through purchase. Second thing, influencers. They figured out that therapy speak is an incredible content format. It's short, it's authoritative sounding. It kind of performs vulnerability without requiring actual vulnerability. And it's endlessly generative. There's always a new term to teach your audience, which means there's always a new video. Also, institutions. I'm talking, universities, HR departments, even some activist spaces. I've seen that have absorbed therapy speak because it's a way to sound like you're taking emotional labor seriously without actually redistributing power or money. Like, we hear you, we're holding space for your feelings, costs the company nothing, but on the other hand, a raise, that costs something. And I think another avenue of this repackaging is a wing of the political right. And they've gotten remarkably fluent in this vocabulary, repurposing self-care and boundaries and protecting your peace into justification for disengaging from collective politics altogether. So, completely different groups and different sources, but same underlying move, which is to take language that was built to help you understand yourself, has kind of been repurposed for something else. And I think we can't talk about what has been lost in this repackaging if we don't understand the origins. And I don't think you can understand what's been lost without understanding where this language actually came from, because it did not start as an escape hatch from politics. It actually started as the exact opposite. The phrase self-care as we use it today has a real whakapapa, and a lot of it traces back to Black feminist thought, particularly writer and poet Audre Lorde. In the early 1980s, while living with cancer, she wrote about caring for herself not as an indulgence, but as a form of survival. And survival specifically as a Black, queer, disabled woman under systems that were never built to keep her alive. For Lorde, resting, tending to your body, refusing to run yourself into the ground for a system that didn't value you, that was all political. It was a way of staying alive and staying in the fight, not a way of leaving it. And, around the same period, the Black Panther Party ran free breakfast programs, free health clinics, free ambulance services in black neighborhoods the state had abandoned. And that's also a version of self-care in its earliest political sense, except it was never about the South alone. It was collective. It was community members literally keeping each other alive because nobody else would. And then our girl, Bell Hooks, picked up this thread later making the argument that healing really happens in isolation, that we heal through connection with each other, not by retreating from each other. Community for her wasn't a nice to have alongside self-care. It basically was self-care, you know. So if we compare to how that self-care functions today, it's almost become like a synonym for withdrawal, right? Cancel plans, self-care, mute a group chat, self-care, skip the protest because it's not good for your mental health right now, self-care. And again, disclaimer, I'm not saying that none of those choices are ever legitimate. Sometimes they absolutely are. Burnout is very real. Capacity is very real. But all I want to say here is notice the shape of the shift. A language built by people fighting to stay engaged with their community, despite a hostile world, got quietly rewritten into a language for disengaging from your community because the world is hostile. Same words, opposite function. And that's what I want to point out here. And, you know, here's where boundaries fits into this, because I think boundaries might be the most repackaged word in this entire therapy speak lexicon. You know, because a boundary, when it's properly understood, is a communicated limit inside an ongoing relationship. Like, I can't take calls after 8 p.m. Please don't comment on my body. You know, and that requires you to stay in a relationship with someone while being honest about your limits. And that's actually really mature and difficult. And, you know, I could do a whole other episode on just boundaries, but it's also not this rigid thing. It's, I don't know, it's ever changing, it's in relation, it's complicated, but, you know, somewhere along the way, boundaries started getting used as a synonym for I'm cutting you off and I don't have to explain why, which sometimes, that is a right call. I just want to say these things are complicated and layered, but, you know, sometimes people genuinely are unsafe and cutting contact is correct. But when every form of avoidance gets relabeled as a boundary, you know, that word stops doing its actual job, which is helping you stay in, helping you stay in relation in a way that makes you feel safe and, in relation. But it's kind of become a permission slip for the easier option, which is leaving. And a culture full of permission slips to leave rather than tools to stay is not a culture that's going to be very good at the much harder, much longer work of organizing, you know, which asks you to stay in the room with people who you disagree with, people who annoy you, people who hurt your feelings, because the goal is bigger than your comfort in the specific meeting. And I think this is something that I've personally seen a lot in so many different co-puppers and different activist spaces. And I think that's quietly one of the most devastating losses in all of this. We've been given a huge vocabulary for identifying what's wrong with a relationship and almost no vocabulary for the slow, unglamorous work of repairing one. You know, rupture and repair, that's actually a real therapeutic concept. And it's the least popularized one because there's no clean, shareable one-line version of, you know, stay in this uncomfortable conversation for another, you know, X amount of time and it might get better. But, you know, cut them off, protect your peace, fits in a caption, fits in a sentence. You know, it doesn't sound as digestible or swallowable as, you know, endure discomfort for the sake of a relationship or a movement that matters more than your immediate comfort. Just kind of shifting tack slightly, I do want to go back to that stat earlier about, you know, how women buy 3/4 of self-help books sold in the US. And I don't think that's by accident. And I don't think it's just about who reads more. I think it's about who in this whole language economy has been aimed at from the start. And I want to specifically talk about girlhood, because I think there is something happening here. I could be wrong, I don't know, but I do feel like there's something here that's worth exploring. So, if you've spent any time on the internet in the last couple of years, you've watched a very specific pipeline, which is girl boss burns out, gets mocked into extinction. I have not heard anyone use girl boss or CEO in a long time. It literally got mocked into extinction. And in its place comes soft life. Healing girl era, that girl, protect your peace. Delulu is the Salulu. That one cracks me up. And on the surface, these look like a rejection of hustle culture. And I suppose generally in part they are. There's something real in women collectively going, actually grinding myself into dust for a corporation, that is not empowerment. That is just exploitation with better branding. But just watch what replaced it, because instead of grinding for a boss, you're now encouraged to grind on yourself. Optimize your morning routine, regulate your nervous system, heal your inner child, journal your way to alignment. It's like the same relentless self-improvement machine, but just pointed inward instead of outward. And crucially, it's just as monetizable, if not more. Every one of those phrases has a product attached: a journal, a supplement, a course, a candle that promises to help you hold space for yourself. And it's a generally clever repackaging, because it uses the language of feminism, which is about self-worth, healing, boundaries, protecting yourself, while quietly stripping out feminism's, oh my gosh, actual's object, which was always supposed to be structural, right? Pay gaps, unpaid domestic labor, reproductive rights, who gets believed and who doesn't. Protect your peace. It sounds like power, right? But if the peace you're protecting is entirely private, just you, your journal, your thoughts, your carefully curated feed, it's power that asks nothing of anyone else and changes nothing about the conditions that exhausted you to begin with. It's a closed loop. You feel better briefly, and the thing that made you tired in the first place, unpaid labor, a culture that still asks women to do most of the emotional and domestic work, a beauty standard that never lets up, stays exactly where it was. There's also a class and race dimension here worth naming. Honestly, the soft life as a marketed aesthetic is expensive. The skincare, the aesthetic minimalism, the ability to actually, step away from hustle culture requires a financial cushion. A lot of young women, especially working class women and women of color, simply don't have. So you end up in a strange situation where the language of rest and softness gets universally marketed to all women, while the material conditions required to actually live that way remain available to a much smaller, wealthier slice. And so, the aesthetic democratizes, but the reality doesn't. And so, I know that I keep coming back to this, but girlhood self-help content teaches women incredible fluency in describing their inner world, but almost no fluency in describing the systems shaping that inner world. And so you can, for example, you can articulate your attachment style in devastating detail, but can you articulate why your rent is 40% of your income? And I think both are worth understanding, don't get me wrong, but only one of them is being marketed to you nonstop. So, let's just sit with that. And here's also another thing that I want to get into about the repackaging of therapy speak. And on the surface, therapy speak reads as very liberal, very, progressive left phenomenon. And, historically, sure, that's roughly where it took root online. But what I want to talk about is it well-documented trend where this exact vocabulary, self-care, healing, trusting your intuition, protecting your energy, has become a bridge into a much more conservative and sometimes explicitly far-right spaces. And you know what? There's an academic term for this. And it's just not something that I'm pulling out of my mind. And I feel like I'm going to say this word incorrectly. Conspirituality. Conspirituality. Yeah, if I say it faster, it makes a lot more sense. Coined back in 2011 by researchers Charlotte Ward and David Voaz. So their observation was that two groups who look completely different on paper, new age wellness communities, which kind of tend to skew politically left, female, and into alternative medicine, and conspiracy theory communities, which have historically skewed male and politically right, actually share a surprisingly similar underlying belief that a secret powerful them is controlling the world, and that mainstream institutions like doctors, governments, media, and yes, therapists can't be trusted to tell you the truth about your own body and mind. And once you accept that premise, the wellness world's language, trust your intuition, do your own research, listen to your body, protect yourself from toxic influences, slides remarkably easily from toxic influences, meaning your ex or your job, into toxic influences, meaning vaccines, mainstream medicine, or just the mainstream narrative more broadly. And a journalist who was covering this, James Ball, gave it a blunter name, the wellness to fascism pipeline. And you can see the mechanics of it pretty clearly once you're looking for them. Wellness culture already primed millions of people, mostly women, to distrust institutions and prize personal intuition above expert consensus. At a moment of real social stress, and I think the pandemic has been the clearest recent example of that, and that same audience, already fluent in the language of protecting your peace, trust your gut, question the mainstream, becomes unusually receptive to conspiracy content that uses identical language but far more dangerous conclusions. But I want to widen this corridor out beyond just the more extreme conspiratorial edge, because I think there's a subtler, much more mainstream version of the same pipeline, and it's showing up specifically in the trad wife and stay-at-home girlfriend content that's just exploded over the last few years. And again, I want to put this disclaimer out that this is not entirely black and white. If this is, you've reevaluated your own life and your values and your worldview, and this is something that generally aligns with that, pop off. Okay, I have no issue with that, but I think there's just a pattern here that we need to open our eyes to. So listen to how that content talks about itself. It's almost never framed as, I believe women belong in the home outright. It's framed in therapy speak. I healed my nervous system by stepping back from the corporate grind. I set a boundary with hustle culture. I found peace in traditional roles. The politics, a fairly conservative vision of gender roles, gets delivered wrapped entirely in the vocabulary of self-care and healing, which makes it feel like a personal wellness choice rather than what it also is, a political and ideological one. It's genuinely hard to argue with rhetorically, because who's going to tell someone that their healing journey is wrong? Right? The language is specifically built to be argument proof. And, again, I want to put a disclaimer and say that this is complicated and nuanced, and there's many truths kind of existing at the same time. Some of that critique under all of this is not baseless. Hustle culture is exhausting. Corporate feminism did often just mean women get to be exploited the same brutal hours as men. Now with a girl boss mug, a real critique of that exists and needed to exist. But the issue isn't that critique is wrong, is that therapy speak lets you deliver a political conclusion. Retreat from public life, retreat from paid work, and retreat from collective struggle. Trust your gut over expertise, while sounding like you're doing nothing more than gently taking care of yourself. And I think that's what makes it an effective vehicle across a surprisingly wide political range, because, it never has to defend itself as a political position because it's dressed as a personal one. So here's the thread connecting everything we've talked about so far. Whether it's a wellness brand selling you a candle, a girlhood influencer selling you a journal, or a trad wife account selling you a worldview, the mechanism is identical. Take a structural, collective, sometimes political problem, translate it into the language of individual healing, sell the individual healing back to the person as the whole solution. The vocabulary is nearly interchangeable across all of it, which tells you something important. The language itself isn't inherently left or right. It's a tool, and right now it's being used across the entire political spectrum for the same basic function, turning collective problems into private ones. So, just trying to pull all of this together, what's actually been lost? Because I am aware that I have throw in a lot at y'all. So what's been lost, I think, is discomfort tolerance. Therapy done properly asks you to sit in something uncomfortable, a hard truth about yourself, a hard conversation with someone else, long enough to actually move through it. Therapy speak, in its repackaged public form, does pretty much the exact opposite. It gives you a fast, authoritative sounding label for the discomfort, which lets you exit the feeling before you've actually metabolized anything. That's just my anxious attachment can be a real insight, but it can also be a very efficient way to stop thinking about why the conversation went badly. Another thing that's been lost is the WE, sorry. Every one of the traditions this language actually descends from, whether it's Lord self-preservation, the Panthers, community clinics, Hooks insistent that healing happens in connection, was built around a collective subject, us, staying alive together under conditions that were trying to kill us separately. But the repackaged version is almost entirely based on the individual. It is very singular. My healing, my boundaries, my peace, my nervous system. So we've gone to we to I, and that's not a small shift. It's a really big shift. And I think another thing that's been lost is the distinction between a feeling and a fact. Like, I feel unsafe is real, valid, and worth taking seriously, but it's not automatically the same claim as this situation is objectively dangerous. I think good therapeutic language holds both of these as true and separate, but repackaged therapy speak often kind of collapses or combines them into one, which sounds validating, but actually removes your ability to check your own reaction against reality, which incidentally is exactly the skill you need to not fall for conspiratorial thinking or to actually repair something instead of just ending it. And and what's been lost, I think, most practically is time, because structural change is slow, organizing is slow, repair is slow. This industry is selling you repackaged self-care. It needs you to believe that healing can happen fast, individually and through purchase, because this will take years and other people, and it might not even work. It doesn't sound good. Like, it just doesn't sell well. So we've built an entire vocabulary optimized for speed when almost everything worth doing, whether it's in a relationship, in a community, in a democracy, healing or processing, runs on a much slower clock. And, none of that means, throw the language out, just throw everything in the bin. But, it means to ask every time you reach for one of these words, ask yourself, am I using this to understand something more clearly or to exit something more quickly? And I suppose the last thing that I want to talk about and how I want to wrap up this episode is kind of to turn the lens back around onto me, onto you in a very honest manner. Because the kaupapa of the show is to never tell you how to think. So I really like to get deep with things and to analyze things down to that structural lens. And so hopefully when you do listen to the kōrero, you can take it however you please. But what I really hope you're doing is that you're taking it to help you digest and process your worldview, your positionality, the lens in which you view this world, because that is where change comes from. That is how change happens. That is how you just check in with yourself all the time. It's an opportunity to self-reflect, because as you change and as your world and life experiences expand, how you view things might be different. Or even if you don't view things differently, you'll get a deeper understanding for it. And I think having that deeper understanding is really helpful. So when you engage with this world, when you have a kōrero with someone, you can communicate that depth. And when you can communicate that depth, your conversations are going to be a lot deeper, and you just never know what change is going to happen from depth. But we need that container for that depth to be communicated and heard and challenged and pulled apart and teased. And so what I really want to do is kind of finish the episode with an opportunity to put it back on ourselves and give us some questions that we can mull over. And I think this will be really good for me too, because even though I do host the show, I am not a perfect person myself. And as I've been recording this, I'm just thinking about my own relationship with therapy speak, and it's definitely something that I have, that repackaged version of therapy speak is something that I've engaged with. And so, for the rest of the episode, I'm not going to tell you anything new. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I really want you to actually sit with them, not perform an answer, not caption it in your head, just really notice what comes up. And if it feels uncomfortable, really, I encourage you even more to sit with that, because there's probably something deeper behind that discomfort. And the first question is, think about the last time you used a piece of therapy language about yourself. Like, I'm setting a boundary. That's my trauma response. I'm protecting my peace. It doesn't matter which one, just find the most recent one. Now then ask yourself, in that moment, was I trying to understand something, or was I trying to end a conversation, or, have an easy way out? And you know what? I encourage you to be fully honest here. There's no wrong answer. And honestly, sometimes ending a conversation is sometimes the exact right move. But notice which one it actually was. Notice if you even know the difference in that moment, or if you only know in hindsight, like right now. Second question, when you hear someone else use therapy speak, maybe it annoyed you a little, even just listening to this episode, maybe you thought of someone who overuses this language, and just ask yourself, what is that irritation actually about? Is it that the words are being misused, or is it something closer to they got to opt out of something, whether it was a friendship or a relationship? It doesn't even have to be a friendship, a relationship, an obligation, a hard conversation and you didn't, or you couldn't, or you wouldn't let yourself. Sometimes our harshest judgment of other people's language is really a judgment of a permission we haven't given ourselves. Not always, but it's definitely worth checking. Third question, and this is the one I think matters most for everything we've talked about today. Think of a structural problem in your life right now, whether it's about money or time or power or something just not great that's happening in your life and isn't really your fault and isn't really fixable by you alone. Whether it's your job, your rent, your workload, your city, discrimination, whatever it may be. Now notice, have you been describing that problem to yourself using the language of a personal deficiency? Like, I just need to manage my stress better. I need better boundaries at work. I need to heal my relationship with money. And notice if the frame you've been handed, quietly by an industry worth $6.7 trillion has an interest in you believing this, but has trained you to look inward for a fix that actually lives outward. And that's not a failure of yours. That's a frame doing exactly what it was built to do. And the last one, and not a question, but more so a practice if you want it. Next time you feel the pull to reach for one of these phrases, holding space or boundary or protecting my peace or trauma response, try just once saying the plain version instead. Not the clinical word, just the actual sentence underneath it. Not, I'm setting a boundary. Just try saying, I don't want to do this. And I'm scared to just say that. Not, that's my anxious attachment. Try, I'm scared you're going to leave, and I don't know how to say that without it sounding needy. Not, I'm protecting my peace. Try, this is hard, and I don't want to do the hard thing right now. And just see what changes. I think you'll find the plain version is scarier to say out loud, and also usually it's more true and it's more human. And truer sentences, even the small ones, are the actual thing that we're all supposedly trying to get back to, which is connection, honesty, being known, not the label, but the actual substance thing itself. And that brings me to the end of this episode. I really hope you've enjoyed this one. I think it's been a corridor that I've been wanting to do for a long time, but there's just so many threads to it because it really has just kind of seeped into every facet into our lives. And honestly, this episode could have been hours and hours long if we spent every moment, kind of every instance that therapy speakers kind of invaded itself into. We would be here for a very long time, but it really has just features in every part of our lives and in so many different institutions as well. And I didn't speak about it very much in this episode because I think it's something that I want to do a bit more research on. But just as I've been recording this episode, another thing that has been coming up that kind of I got reminded of was, not only is it therapy speak that's kind of being weaponized, it's also like the neurodivergency corridor has also kind of been a lot recently as well. Whether it's people feeling like they can diagnose other people with autism or ADHD or any kind of neurodivergency, or people using their neurodivergency as just like how therapy speak, it sounds like on the surface it has a lot of substance, but it actually doesn't communicate any depth at all, and it's kind of used as a shield to choose the easier option. I've kind of noticed that in the neurodivergency space as well. Just people using their neurodivergency as an explanation and then therefore as an excuse for just not cool behaviors. And I think that also needs to be addressed as well. Definitely by someone who's got more mana in the space and authority to speak to it, but it's just something that I've noticed anecdotally as well, that it's not just therapy speak, but it's also the whole neurodivergency speak, that it's also, there's been a repackaging there, and I think it does go hand in hand with therapy speak, the repackaging of therapy speak as well. So I just want to put that out there. But yeah, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. I hope you've enjoyed, and we'll catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.